August 1990. In a single night, Saddam Hussein's army swept into Kuwait, one of the richest nations on earth. The world was stunned. Would he control the oil of the Gulf, and with it, the global economy? What followed was a storm like no other. 35 nations united. 500,000 troops filled the desert. 6 weeks of relentless airstrikes. Then 100 hours of tanks and fire that shattered Iraq's army and freed Kuwait. But Saddam survived, and the shadow of that war would stretch into sanctions, uprisings, and the path to 2003. This is the story of the Gulf War, told by Erahive, where history speaks, revised. The shadow of a costly victory. Iraq in the late 1980s was a nation scarred. 8 years of war with Iran had left 500,000 dead, cities in ruins, and a people exhausted. Saddam Hussein declared victory, but victory came with a bill his country could not pay. $80 billion in debt, an army devouring nearly half the budget just to exist, oil prices collapsing as neighbors like Kuwait pumped beyond their quotas. Every drop in price cost Iraq billions, money Saddam needed to hold on to power. Inside Iraq, despair spread. Families who had lost sons to war now faced hunger and joblessness. Shia and Kurdish communities, long repressed, simmered with resentment. Saddam ruled through fear, but even fear could not feed a nation. To him, survival meant strength. He could not cut the army. His generals might turn on him. He could not admit weakness. His enemies might rise against him. He needed an answer, a target, and just across the border was Kuwait, small, rich, and vulnerable. A neighbor Saddam believed owed Iraq its very existence and its wealth. The solution in his eyes was clear. If Iraq could not recover, it would take what it needed. Revised. Target Kuwait, a tiny desert kingdom, smaller than New Jersey, home to less than 2 million people, but beneath its sand lay an ocean of oil. To Saddam Hussein, Kuwait wasn't just a neighbor, it was a prize. During the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait had lent billions to Baghdad. Saddam demanded those debts be erased. He claimed Iraq had bled for the Arab world, shielding the Gulf from Iran's revolution. Kuwait refused. Worse, it kept pumping oil beyond OPEC limits, driving prices lower and strangling Iraq's recovery. To Saddam, this was no accident. It was economic war. He accused Kuwait of stealing oil from the Rumaila field, of conspiring with the West to break Iraq. But it wasn't only about money. It was pride. Iraq saw itself as the rightful leader of the Arab world, a nation of 17 million, with an army 1 million strong. Kuwait, in Saddam's eyes, was nothing but a colonial creation, carved out by the British, an illegitimate state sitting on riches that should be his. By the summer of 1990, Saddam's patience was gone. He massed 100,000 troops on the Kuwaiti border. Diplomats called it posturing, a bluff to force negotiations. But Saddam was not bluffing, not this time. On August 2nd, he rolled the dice. Revised. The invasion. August 2nd, 1990. Just after 2 a.m., the desert roared to life. Engines thundered. Tanks rolled across the sand. Helicopters skimmed low over the Gulf. Saddam Hussein's army, 100,000 strong, poured into Kuwait. At the tip of the spear, his Republican Guard, veterans of 8 years of war. Kuwait's defense crumbled. Its army was small, caught off guard, and hopelessly outmatched. Still, resistance flared. At Dasman Palace, the emir's brother led a desperate stand, fighting until the palace burned around him. By dawn, he was dead, and Kuwait's fate was sealed. Within 2 days, the country was gone. The royal family fled. The banks were looted. $2 billion seized from the central bank. Civilians dragged from homes, tortured, executed. And Saddam announced Kuwait was no longer a nation at all. It was Iraq's 19th province. But if Saddam believed the world would look away, he was wrong. In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia panicked. If Kuwait could fall overnight, so could they. In Washington, George H.W. Bush drew a line. Saddam's aggression would not stand. And around the world, alarm bells rang louder than Saddam ever imagined. Kuwait had been taken. Now, the world would strike back. Revised. The world responds. By sunrise, the world knew Iraq had swallowed Kuwait. In Washington, George H.W. Bush declared Saddam's aggression would not stand. To many, Kuwait was just a small desert state. But to the White House, the stakes were global. If Saddam held Kuwait, he controlled much of the world's oil. In London, Margaret Thatcher pressed Bush not to hesitate. This is no time to go wobbly, she warned. Appeasement had failed before. It would fail again. Even Moscow condemned the invasion. The Soviet Union, once Iraq's ally, now stood beside the United States. The Cold War was fading, and in its twilight, old rivals united. Across the Arab world, fear spread. If Kuwait could fall, who was next? Egypt and Syria broke with Saddam, pledging troops to the coalition. Most crucial of all, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia invited American forces to defend his kingdom. The United Nations moved fast. Sanctions choked Baghdad. Resolution 678 set a deadline. Iraq must leave Kuwait by January 15, 1991, or face war. Instead of dividing the world, Saddam had done the impossible. He had united it, and as the clock ticked down, soldiers and machines from 35 nations began pouring into the Arabian desert. Operation Desert Shield. The Saudi desert turned into an armed fortress. Convoys of American tanks rumbled off cargo ships. Giant transport planes landed one after another, unloading men, helicopters, and mountains of supplies. Engineers carved bases out of sand. Tent cities rose overnight. It was the largest military buildup since World War II. 500,000 troops from 35 nations gathered under one mission: defend Saudi Arabia and prepare to drive Iraq from Kuwait. The coalition was diverse: Americans, British, French, Egyptians, Saudis, Syrians. Unlikely allies now standing side by side. But Saddam struck back in his own way. He seized hundreds of foreigners, calling them guests. In truth, they were human shields scattered across Iraq to deter bombs. The move only hardened the world's resolve. Refugees fled Kuwait with stories of executions and torture. Oil fires burned, looting spread. Saddam had overplayed his hand, and the coalition's case for war grew stronger by the day. By year's end, the desert was bristling with armor, aircraft, and determination. The UN deadline loomed: January 15, 1991. Withdraw or face force. Saddam refused. He dug trenches, laid mines, and fortified Kuwait. But as he prepared for a long war, the coalition readied something far different: a storm from the sky. Air war, Desert Storm. January 17, 1991, midnight. The deadline had passed. The desert sky erupted. Stealth bombers slipped over Baghdad, dropping precision bombs before anyone knew they were there. Apaches struck radar sites, blinding Iraq's defenses. Then came the flood. Fighters, bombers, and cruise missiles hammering airfields, bunkers, and command centers. For Iraq's soldiers, the night was chaos. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky like fireworks, but they were shooting blind. In days, Saddam's air force was shattered. Some destroyed, others fleeing to Iran. The bombardment never stopped. 42 days, over 100,000 sorties, bridges, railways, depots, all gone. Iraqi divisions pinned down, cut off, unable to move without being annihilated from above. Saddam's answer was the Scud missile, launched at Israel and Saudi Arabia. Crude and inaccurate, but dangerous. His hope: drag Israel into war, split the coalition. Israel held its fire. The alliance stayed firm. And as bombs rained down, Saddam set fire to Kuwait's oil wells. Black smoke turned day into night, creating one of history's worst environmental disasters. By February, Iraq's army was crippled, but Saddam would not retreat. The air war had broken his defenses. Now came the ground. The 100-hour ground war, February 24, 1991, dawn. After 6 weeks of bombardment, the ground assault began. Coalition forces surged forward: Marines, British, French, Egyptians, Saudis, 500,000 troops under General Norman Schwarzkopf. Ahead of them lay trenches, minefields, and Saddam's elite Republican Guard. But the coalition didn't strike head-on. Instead, Schwarzkopf unleashed the left hook. While Marines stormed Kuwait from the south, U.S. armored divisions swept wide through western Iraq, swinging behind Saddam's lines. The trap was closing. Kuwaiti defenses collapsed within hours. Iraqi conscripts, exhausted and terrified, surrendered in droves, some even to news crews. But the Republican Guard fought back. At 73 Easting, American tanks clashed with Saddam's best. Smoke, sand, and rain blinded the desert, but U.S. Abrams tanks, with thermal sights, fired through the storm. In hours, more than 100 Iraqi tanks lay burning. At Medina Ridge, the Guard made its last stand: 300 tanks against the U.S. 1st Armored Division. 2 hours later, the Guard was broken. By February 27th, Kuwait City was free. Iraqi troops fled north, their retreat turning into the infamous Highway of Death. Miles of burning vehicles, twisted metal, and shattered lives. After just 100 hours, Iraq's army was in ruins. Tens of thousands surrendered. Saddam's gamble had collapsed, and then came the order: stop. The war was over, or so it seemed. Revised, Smoke and Ceasefire. February 28, 1991. Just 100 hours after the ground war began, President George H.W. Bush announced, "Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our objectives are met." The guns fell silent, but the desert was still burning. As Iraqi forces fled, they torched hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells. Flames roared into the sky, spewing black smoke that blotted out the sun. Day turned to night, the air thick with poison, the sand drenched in oil. Some fires would rage for months before they were finally tamed. Kuwait was free, but cloaked in smoke. And Saddam? He survived. His army shattered, his regime battered, but his throne intact. He declared victory of another kind, that Iraq had faced the world and endured. Inside his borders, few dared to disagree. The coalition stopped at Kuwait. They would not march to Baghdad. Occupation risked tearing the alliance apart, dragging the world into a far bloodier war. So Saddam remained, bloodied but unbroken. The storm had ended, but new tempests were already forming. Revised, unfinished business. The ceasefire brought no peace to Iraq. In the south, Shia rebels rose up. In the north, the Kurds seized towns and declared themselves free. Encouraged by whispers from Washington, they believed Saddam's fall was near. For a moment, it seemed the regime might collapse, but Saddam still had weapons and fear. His Republican Guard returned with helicopters and tanks. Rebel cities were shelled, villages were burned, civilians fled into marshes and mountains, hunted by their own army. Tens of thousands were killed, buried in mass graves. The uprisings were crushed in blood. The coalition did not intervene. Their mandate had been Kuwait, not Baghdad. To the rebels, it was betrayal. To Saddam, it was survival. Sanctions stayed in place. Iraq's economy collapsed. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Food lines grew. Children starved. For ordinary Iraqis, the Gulf War never ended. It lingered in hunger and fear. But Saddam remained defiant. He defied inspectors, taunted the West, and clung to power through terror. To Washington, he became the war unfinished, the enemy left standing. And in the years ahead, the shadow of 1991 stretched long, through no-fly zones, airstrikes, and finally, the invasion of 2003. The Gulf War had ended quickly, but its consequences had only just begun. The Gulf War ended in days, but its shadow lasted for decades. For the coalition, it was a triumph of unity and technology, a war won in 100 hours. For Iraq, it was the beginning of sanctions, uprisings, and years of suffering. Saddam Hussein survived the storm, but his gamble left scars that would bleed into the war of 2003 and far beyond. History remembers Desert Storm as swift, but its legacy is measured not in days, but in generations. Because history is never just battles and dates. It is choices, consequences, and the voices of those who lived through them. This was Erahive, where history speaks.